I'm Nima Rajan. Trucking associations are warning that Saturday's deadline for drivers to be vaccinated before entering Canada will lead to severe driver shortages and increased strain on supply chains. The head of the Canadian Trucking Alliance says about 10% of Canadian big riggers who cross the border aren't vaccinated. The American Trucking Association estimates just under half of its members won't be able to enter Canada. Trade groups and the federal Conservatives want the government to postpone the Saturday deadline, which was announced about 2 months ago. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association thinks Quebec is on shaky ground with its plan to tax adults who refuse to be vaccinated. It points out that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms recognizes individual autonomy over our bodies and medical decisions. Advocates working with Black and Indigenous Canadians say the plan risks adding another burden to already marginalized people. The military has stepped in to help provinces struggling with pandemic shortages of doctors and nurses, but the Canadian Armed Forces says its medical personnel are being stretched to the limit. And it now says it doesn't have the resources to offer much help to provinces. A Defense Department spokesman says the military currently has only 50% of the doctors, 75% of the nurses, and 65% of the medical technicians that it needs to meet its own requirements. Canadian hospitals were already dealing with medical imaging backlogs before the pandemic hit, and as Omicron threatens to overwhelm the healthcare system, the situation is getting worse. The president of the Canadian Association of Radiologists says many CT scan and MRI appointments are being cancelled. That's a key concern because early detection of many diseases is important to a patient's successful recovery and cure. The union representing Alberta paramedics is raising concerns amid a historic number of service calls. Mike Parker, the president of the Health Sciences Association of Alberta, says the EMS system has never been stretched this thin. Alberta Health Services confirms there has been a 30% increase in emergency calls over the past several months. It says COVID-19 and opioid patients are driving that demand. This includes a large number of inter-facility patient transports of people with the virus. A record number of people died last year from drug overdoses in Saskatchewan. The Saskatchewan Coroner Service says 464 people died from confirmed or suspected drug overdoses. That is up from 327 in 2020 and 179 in 2019. Rainfall warnings remain in effect in southern BC as the second in a series of atmospheric river sweeps into the province. By the time a final burst hits tomorrow, some areas could see up to 150 millimeters of rain. The River Forecast Center is warning some roads near waterways could be washed out. China has become the third country to suspend imports of Canadian beef due to the discovery of a case of mad cow disease on an Alberta farm. The Philippines and South Korea had earlier halted imports of Canadian beef. This was after the discovery of the atypical strain of BSE, which poses no risk to human health. But the move by China will have a bigger impact because it is Canada's third largest export market for beef, worth $170 million a year. A technical meeting was set for Wednesday between Canadian and American officials. This is over the suspension of Prince Edward Island potato exports to the U.S. Canada banned U.S.-bound shipments of fresh PEI potatoes in November. This was following the discovery of potato wart fungus in 2 fields. Farmers say there's no scientific basis for the halt, and they wanted the suspension to be lifted. But Canadian officials say the U.S. has since imposed its own suspension and is demanding more safety information first. The first plane load of Afghan refugees has landed in Canada 6 months after the government's promise to help thousands of women leaders, human rights activists, and journalists escape the Taliban-ruled country. Immigration Minister Sean Fraser announced the arrival of 250 Afghan refugees on Tuesday. The first 170 were admitted through a special program for human rights defenders. The government promised to resettle 40,000 Afghans. However, fewer than 7,000 have arrived so far. Canada will spearhead a 10-year drive by the United Nations to revive and protect worldwide Indigenous languages. Aluki Kotiark, Inuit representative on a UNESCO task force set to mark a decade of Indigenous languages, says she wants Canada to set an example. She wants Inuktitut to be an official national language alongside English and French. The global task force will continue until 2032 and includes Inuit, First Nations, and Métis representatives. All right, stay tuned. We'll be right back after the break, where we take a look at a potential Omicron peak in an interview with Dr. Abhishek Raut, medical director at Appletree Medical Group. Stay with us. Scientists are seeing signals that COVID-19's alarming Omicron wave may have peaked in Britain and is about to do the same in the U.S., at which point cases may start dropping off dramatically. The reason is because the variant has proved to be so wildly contagious that it may already be running out of people to infect, just a month and a half after it was first detected in South Africa. Dr. David Heyman, the former head of the World Health Organization's Infectious Diseases Department, says Britain is the closest to any country of being out of the pandemic, and that COVID-19 is inching towards becoming endemic. Ali Mokdad, a professor of health metrics sciences at the University of Washington in Seattle, says Omicron is going to come down as fast as it went up. So will this be the same case for Canada? Well, joining us now to talk more on this is Dr. Abhishek Raut, medical director at Appletree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks so much for having me.
So some promising news here, Dr. Raut, but let's start with a quick overview of how many Canadians have been infected with Omicron so far.
Yeah, so Canada has documented more cases of COVID-19 via Omicron in the first 40 days than it did in the entire first year of the pandemic. There have been more than 777,000 cases of new confirmed infections of Omicron, and which started at the end of November. In contrast, it took us 370 days to get that same number when we had that first case of COVID-19 in January 25th, 2020. There have also been more than 4 times the number of active cases now than during the peak of the second or third waves in this winter and spring of last year.
So that's very interesting, Dr. Raut. Do you think Canada is at its peak of infections just as Britain may be?
I think we may be entering soon into the place where we'll start to see a decline. Keep in mind, it's very difficult to know when a peak is happening. You literally have to wait until it passes. Having said that, we do have factors we look at to see if a peak is nearing. We look at tests in the community, positivity rates of these tests, and also wastewater analysis. Looking at these 3 indicators, we think we might be nearing a peak, likely in a few weeks. But remember, these are just estimates, but we're very hopeful we'll get there soon.
Hopeful indeed, Dr. Raut. Well, if we reach this peak, will Canada reach this endemic level, as some doctors are speculating about Britain?
Right. I appreciate the underlying question here is, when is this all going to end? And I think the good news here is most experts agree that it will end. We may not totally be able to eradicate COVID-19, but we'll see it move out into an endemic phase rather than a pandemic phase. When we see endemic, what that means is there aren't these crazy large spikes up and down. The reproductive number of the disease is actually very small and also very consistent. We are nowhere near that right now. We still have massive fluctuations and peaks. However, the hope is that we will see these numbers stabilize in the future.
And Omicron is not the first variant of the coronavirus. So how likely are we to see another virus variant pop up and cause an infectious wave following Omicron?
Viruses, especially coronaviruses, are always mutating. Most of the time, these mutations don't change much about a virus, and so we don't even classify it as a variant of concern. But sometimes these multiple mutations can lead to a very distinct variant, which causes far more infections. For example, Delta only really had 13 mutations, and it's been an extremely chaotic variant with high infection rates. Interestingly, Omicron had about 50 mutations, so making it much more contagious than Delta, but not as high a hospitalization rate. So overall, I think we will continue to see mutations occur, and therefore the chances of a new variant is actually quite high.
And considering that Omicron, some early studies suggest Omicron is milder than the Delta variant, what would you say to those who are thinking about catching Omicron and maybe getting this all over with?
We have a surprising amount of data for this. So if we remember, the pox parties back in the day were when people gathered together to get this natural immunity against chickenpox for their kids. And they also did that for measles. So what did we learn from that? So one, we learned that in these pox parties per se, kids got more than just chickenpox and measles. They got sick from strep, staph infections, Hep B, along with many others. And the second and more important point was that children could and still can die from things like chickenpox and measles. So having exposure to these in a form which is better, which is a vaccination, is much safer than the idea there. So the idea of getting it over with an infection can be extremely dangerous.
All right, Dr. Rao, just about 30 seconds left here, but what are your thoughts on these booster shots being recommended for all Canadians?
Right now, what we know is adding a third dose increases the antibody titers by 25 times compared to 2 doses. And the impact of this is protection against getting COVID to up to 75% after the booster. But remember, boosters just force the virus to not produce as much, which means we may see less mutations as well. So from an individual and population perspective, it makes a lot of sense to get those boosters.
We'll be right back, everyone. Stay tuned. After some tense discussions, NATO and Russia have agreed to try to schedule more meetings about Ukraine's future. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says both parties expressed the need to dialogue and explore a schedule of future meetings, despite tensions over Moscow's military buildup near Ukraine. He says there are still significant differences between NATO allies and Russia on the issue, and he stressed that Ukraine has the right to decide its future security arrangements on its own. He also said that NATO would continue to leave the door open to new members. Well, with us now to unpack this situation is Bradley Bowman, the Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Bowman, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Now, I know the issue of rising tensions between Russia and NATO is really not new, but can you outline this latest dispute to our viewers?
Absolutely. So what has essentially happened in the last few weeks or months has been that Russia has assembled approximately 100,000 combat forces on the borders of Ukraine. I mean, to Ukraine's north, to Ukraine's east, and also in the south in Crimea, which some of your viewers may recall is actually part of Ukraine that Russia illegally invaded and annexed in 2014. And we're not just, these are not just logistical personnel. These are combat troops. I'm talking about main battle tanks. I'm talking about infantry fighting vehicles, multiple launch rocket systems, everything that Vladimir Putin would need to conduct a major new invasion of Ukraine. What's his goal? His goal is, in my view, to bully Kyiv, to bully Ukraine. For what purpose? He wants them not to become a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
All right, sir. Well, we know both sides, Russia and NATO, have agreed to further talks. What are the main points in the negotiations so far?
The main points are that, Vladimir Putin's objectives and the objectives of NATO, frankly, are at loggerheads. They're really in direct contradiction. And if we zoom out for a moment, really what's at stake here? In my view, what's at stake is two worldviews. A worldview of Vladimir Putin might makes right, that I'm powerful, I'm more powerful than you, and therefore I can tell you what to do, Ukraine. I can tell you what to do, Georgia. It's that worldview, which kind of sounds a little bit like the 19th century, doesn't it? And a worldview of territorial integrity, national sovereignty, and the rule of law. I mean, the question for your viewers is, should the people of Ukraine have the right to determine with whom they associate? That's the question. If you say no, and if you say that, then you're with Vladimir Putin, I would say. If you say yes, then you're with NATO. And so that's the core conflict. And so what has Vladimir Putin done? He's very shrewdly assembled this combat power around Ukraine, as I've said, to do what the late and former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz said, to cast a shadow of power over the negotiating table. At a minimum, he gets his concessions at the negotiating table, or he conducts the invasion. And he's been deliberately vague on that. His staffers are saying, oh, no, we're not interested. But then Vladimir Putin says, well, if we don't get what we want, we're going to have to pursue a, quote, military technical solution. We all know what that means.
Now, this is a very interesting tension point, sir. Considering NATO is a defensive alliance, why is Russia thinking the expansion of NATO would be a threat to it?
It's a good question. I would ask the same question. I would go further. I would state the following fact, is that NATO is not an offensive threat to Vladimir Putin. And I think he knows it. I understand the historical Russian sensibilities. I understand, we can talk about Napoleon's invasion. We can talk about World War II. I get it. But there is no desire on the part of the United States, our NATO allies, or Ukraine to threaten Russia. But here's the irony. Vladimir Putin's own actions are demonstrating the need for NATO, right? He has not done what he's done against the Baltic member states, which are members of NATO, because he knows that would have invoked the NATO treaty, the Article 5 commitment, that an attack against one is attack against all. Instead, he went after Ukraine, which is not a NATO member. So he himself is making the case for everyone to see in Eastern Europe that, wow, NATO membership is value, and that makes Kyiv, that makes Ukraine want that membership all the more. So the problem is not Ukraine, in my view. The problem is the aggressive behavior of Vladimir Putin. And that's not an intellectual thing or a guess. That is history. That's 2014 Crimea invasion. He's his own worst enemy.
All right, Mr. Bowman, just about 30 seconds left here. But what do you expect from the next round of talks?
I think Vladimir Putin is going to see if he can accomplish his objectives at the negotiating table. So far, I'm glad to see that we're not giving in to these his demands, which I think would be betrayal of the core tenets of our democratic principles and the NATO alliance. And so it's ultimately come down to Vladimir Putin, and he may not know what he's going to do. But I think we have to help Ukraine have the capability to defend their country. And the more powerful Ukraine is, the less likely Putin is to come in and try to accomplish his political objectives with military force.
All right, sir. We'll definitely have to keep an eye on this developing situation. Mr. Bowman, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
We'll be back with a look at the markets after the break. Welcome back. Forum Daily's weekly market update with Catherine Murray. The host of The Buck Stops Here is up next. Take it away, Catherine.
Thanks, Nima. Hello, everyone, and welcome to your weekly market recap. I'm Catherine Murray. Well, markets actually have stabilized today over the past couple of trading sessions, in fact, following a very rough start to 2022. Investors were very much in sell mode, really concerned about the Omicron variant derailing the economic recovery, leading to further supply chain concerns and disruptions and higher inflation, and therefore what the U.S. Federal Reserve may or may not do in terms of their tightening cycle. So that's kind of how we entered the year. There's also, of course, concern about peak earnings, and it will be very important to hear company management's comments surrounding their view of the economic recovery as they start to report the fourth quarter earnings this week. So a lot going on. What's interesting, though, is we've actually seen, as I said, some nice stabilization in the market, and that does continue today. It seems, though, yesterday there was a shift in sentiment following U.S. Fed Chair Jerome Powell's comments at his confirmation hearing, where he indicated that at the end of the day, the Fed is still going to use their tools. In other words, the Fed has your back. And there's an old adage on Wall Street and Bay Street, which is don't fight the Fed. Of course, this is one area that has been so supportive of financial markets since the financial crisis, that being the Fed's accommodative policy stance. So the market sentiment seemed to turn on that news yesterday, and it is continuing today. Interestingly, the big news today is that U.S. CPI number, that reading of 7%. That's the fastest annualized inflation number we've seen since 1982. And the markets actually took it in stride, almost shrugged it off a little bit. Then the markets declined, and now they look to be marching higher today. And the reason probably why the markets shrugged it off is because everybody's expecting higher inflation. So perhaps it was somewhat priced in. Interestingly, just in terms of some of the data points here, we did see used cars, rent, and airline prices all were higher in the month of December. Food and energy actually trended a little bit lower. But let's step back for 1 second here, because I'm sure we're all feeling the inflation effects right now. And if you take a look at used cars and trucks, they're up 52% since February of 2020. That, of course, was pre-COVID. So again, just to kind of put it in perspective, and you're not imagining the inflation that you're seeing and feeling. So we did see the markets kind of move either side of unchanged following the inflation reading this morning. Investors now very much focused on the fourth quarter results. And the bull case perhaps as well, that some investors are queuing off of, are that scientists are seeing some signs that Omicron might have peaked in Britain, and therefore the United States might follow suit not too long from now. So that obviously would be a positive. But in terms of the market dynamics that we're really seeing over the past couple of days, you had a nice rebound in the price of oil. It was up by about 4% yesterday. It's continuing that upward march today. That, of course, takes all the energy stocks along with it. Some of the seniors, such as Suncor, Cenovus, and CNQ, they were all up by about 2 to 4% yesterday. We're also seeing some nice strength today. The intermediates and juniors, which have a little bit more torque or leverage to the price of WTI, they were up by 3 to 7%. And also, the Canadian dollar had a big move yesterday. Again, we are so often viewed as a commodity currency, so WTI, the Canadian dollar up. And also, we moved the Canadian dollar, that is, on better risk sentiment, which, as I said, is what we started to see shift to the positive side yesterday. Also, we had Bitcoin rebound a little bit as well. That also started the year off to a down note, that's for sure. A couple of interesting stocks and stories to watch. Shake Shack guided for a better fourth quarter revenue, setting that stock up by 13% yesterday. They did, however, note that COVID is weighing, of course, on staffing. LVS, Las Vegas Sands, if you like to look at some of the casino stocks, that was upgraded to a buy, and also the focus left over at JP Morgan, saying that there's an attractive risk reward, which might be the case because a lot of those stocks have been hit. And away from that, in Canada, no major economic data releases this week. As I mentioned, energy has been performing very well. Talon Metals, a stock I'm not familiar with, the ticker there is TLO. It was up by about 14% yesterday. That's on news. It entered into an agreement with Tesla for the supply and purchase of nickel concentrate. And Canaccord is out with a positive note on Canadian telcos, saying that there's a strong case to own them in 2022. Stepping back once again, I think we're in a little bit of a holding pattern right now as we start to get those fourth quarter earnings releases from those U.S. companies. We'll have to hear from the company management to make sure that they believe that the economic outlook is strong and strong enough to see growth and growth that supports the valuations in light of a U.S. Fed tightening cycle. That's the $1 million question, Nima, in terms of can the valuations hold? I'll send it back to you.
Thanks for that, Catherine. All right, take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.